Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq, with daily insight on the Nasdaq-100 index, or the NDX, which is made up of 100 of the largest domestic and international non-financial innovative companies listed on Nasdaq. The NDX has been the barometer for U.S. large cap growth and also one of the best performing indexes over the last decade and a half, not to mention one of the most liquid index ecosystems in the world. Joining me this Tuesday afternoon, we have Shawn, Cruz, manager of trader services at TD Ameritrade, to discuss Nasdaq-100 performance, trends in the Nasdaq Volatility Index, and we'll also take a look at INTU earnings. Shawn, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks. So let's take a look at your first chart here with some fresh levels on the Nasdaq-100.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch what's been going on with indices across the board the past week or so. So there was a little bit of a scare last week after the Fed minutes that they might be tightening policy, which would presumably lead to higher rates sooner rather than later. I think over the weekend, there's been a little bit of a change in the outlook for what the Fed is going to be doing. They will eventually probably be tightening policy and tapering asset purchases, but maybe not as soon as markets were expecting when they first got those minutes last week. So after hitting a low and coming back in and testing some support levels that we've been discussing, it's really just skyrocketed higher. And now we're sitting right around new all-time highs today. The one thing that'll be interesting to see if maybe we get a little bit of consolidation there. If we look at relative strength, not really in overbought territory just yet. But if you look back historically, when you do get to this level on the relative strength indicator, there's usually a little bit of sideways consolidation, and that can actually be useful in building a base for another leg higher. So I think a little bit of sideways consolidation up at these levels would actually be a good sign and set us up for further upside here moving forward.
And Shawn, of course, everyone wants to know if we could potentially see some volatility that comes out of Jackson Hole and the Fed and going into September with school starting and the Delta variant. Are you seeing any clues from the Nasdaq Volatility Index that could suggest there's a little bit of bumpiness on the horizon?
Well, I think if you look at these high growth, high multiple stocks, they really tend to not favor higher interest rates or more with a tightened monetary policy environment. And I think what we're seeing out of Vol Q, which is sort of that forward-looking measure of implied volatility or uncertainty, we're seeing it really pull back to some lows that would be consistent to me with a little bit more of dovish activity on the monetary policy front. So certainly right now, nothing really flashing any sort of warning signs. And I think when you're seeing the market move to all-time highs and you've seen a little bit of consolidation in a lot of the components of the Nasdaq-100, doesn't surprise me to see that historical volatility translating into some extremely low levels of forward-looking volatility.
And Shawn, before we get into it, let's take a look at what's happening with some of these Chinese tech names, because they've quietly been doing really well to kind of hide whatever's going on underneath the surface.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a good sign. You do have some of these Chinese stocks up quite a bit today. I think, one, there's just the sense that there would be some sort of buying the pullback in these names, because I don't think you're going to see investors, by and large, all of a sudden want to completely remove all exposure to China. So I was expecting some opportunistic buying to come in at some point or another. But I do think that this is a sort of another case for the potential for the Nasdaq-100 to consolidate here. If you look across the board, it's a little bit mixed today. You have Google, Amazon up higher, but then you have Microsoft and Apple a little bit lower on the day. So I think with the mixed picture you're seeing here, this is sort of on the internals where you have a little bit of handing off of leadership from one day to the next that can drive some of that consolidation, which will create a feedback loop to me in terms of that will drive historical volatility lower in the NASDAQ, which could also justify some lower levels of that forward-looking vol Q.
And to wrap up here, let's take a look and preview some INTU.
INTU's going to be an interesting earnings report to watch. Right now, there's an expectation for about a $16 move in either direction, just looking at what some of the derivatives are pricing in. It's really interesting if you look at their business and start looking at their revenue. A very high margin line of business for them is sort of that consumer business, which if you may know it better as TurboTax, which is an Intuit company. They also recently have a Credit Karma that has come in and started contributing. But I really think right now it's going to be on the small business and self-employed segments, which is sort of that small businesses have to file their tax returns. That's why you see the seasonality here. Q3 is usually very strong from that business line because that's when everyone is filing taxes. But it doesn't look like there's a big expectation for that maybe to fall as low as maybe it has historically. So it really will come out to, one, can they maintain a little bit of growth in that small business and self-employed segment, but also not having too big of a pullback in that the consumer segment from their TurboTax business. So year over year comps will be really important when we're looking at this, not so much quarter to quarter, because we're going to want to see how much they're able to sustain in terms of growth from Q4 last year out of that consumer segment.
All right. Appreciate the insight as always, Shawn. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.